In January 1980, the New England Journal of Medicine published a letter to the editor. The letter was 1 paragraph long. It contained 5 sentences. It contained 101 words. It was written by a graduate student named Jane Porter and her supervisor, Dr. Herschelig, a drug safety researcher at Boston University Medical Center. They had reviewed records from a hospital database records of patients who had received narcotic painkillers during hospital stays, and they had found something that seemed, at the time, reassuring. Out of 882 hospitalized patients who had received at least one narcotic painkiller, only 4 had developed documented addiction. Only one of those cases was considered serious. The drugs involved were meperidine, bercodam, and hydromorphone drugs given to patients during inpatient stays, administered by medical staff for short periods in controlled hospital settings. Their conclusion, in the letter's final sentence, the sentence that would be cited 608 times, extracted from its context, inflated beyond its evidence, weaponized by pharmaceutical marketing departments, and eventually deployed as scientific cover for the largest drug-induced public health catastrophe in American history was this. We conclude that despite widespread use of narcotic drugs in hospitals, the development of addiction is rare in medical patients with no history of addiction. 11 words. Or, if you count only the operative conclusion, 5. The development of addiction is rare. That is the sentence. That is what was published. In 101 words. In a paragraph. In the New England Journal of Medicine. In 1980. By 2 researchers who were reporting on short-term, monitored, inpatient narcotic use in a hospital. What that sentence was not about. Long-term outpatient use. Patients taking powerful opioids daily for months or years. Patients managing chronic pain at home. Unsupervised. With refillable prescriptions. The elderly. The young. The populations most vulnerable to dependency. The specific, pharmacological profile of OxyContin, an opioid twice as potent as morphine, formulated to deliver its full payload in a controlled-release pill designed for around-the-clock chronic pain management. The sentence was not about any of those things. Jick and Porter were reporting on hospital patients on short intravenous courses. Any careful reader of the letter, any reader who read past the last sentence to the data it described would have understood that the finding had no bearing on long-term outpatient opioid prescribing. Most readers did not read the letter carefully. Most readers did not read it at all. They read the title, Addiction Rare, in Patients Treated with Narcotics. They saw that it was in the New England Journal of Medicine. They cited it in academic papers, in textbooks, in clinical guidelines, in pharmaceutical marketing materials. The development of addiction is rare. They cited those 5 words as if they were a clinical trial, as if they were peer-reviewed evidence, as if they were science. In 2017, 37 years after the letter was published, Canadian researchers analyzed all 608 citations of Porter and Jick. They found that 2% of the papers that cited it used it as evidence that addiction was rare in patients treated with opioids. They found that 88% did not mention that the patients in the original letter were hospitalized at the time they received the prescription. They found that some papers had, as they put it diplomatically, grossly misrepresented the letter's conclusions. 1998 paper, citing Porter and Jick, stated, "This pain population with no abuse history is literally at no risk for addiction." Another, from 2002, medical opioid addiction is very rare. The Canadian researchers concluded that the citation pattern had contributed to the North American opioid crisis. by helping to shape a narrative that allayed prescribers' concerns about the risk of addiction associated with long-term opioid therapy. The NEJM put an editor's note on the letter, 37 years after publication. The note read, "For reasons of public health, readers should be aware that this letter has been heavily and uncritically cited as evidence that addiction is rare with opioid therapy. By 2017, more than 183,000 Americans had died from prescription opioid overdoses since 1999. Dr. Herschelyk, when contacted by journalists, said, "I'm essentially mortified that letter to the editor was used as an excuse to do what these drug companies did. They used this letter to spread the word that these drugs were not very addictive." Asked whether he regretted writing it, he said, "The answer is, fundamentally, assure. The letter wasn't of value to health and medicine in and of itself. So if I could take it back, if I knew then what I know now, I would never have published it. It wasn't worth it." He was right. It wasn't worth it. But here's the thing about Porter and Jick, and the thing that makes this episode different from a story about scientific negligence or the uncritical citation habits of academic medicine. The letter did not cause the opioid epidemic. The letter was a negligible paragraph in a medical journal that would, in the ordinary course of events, have been cited 11 times the median for letters to the editor published in the same issue and then forgotten. It was not a study. It was not evidence. It had no particular scientific authority. It said something that superficially resembled what people wanted to hear. And it appeared in a prestigious journal. And by itself it would have done almost nothing. What turned it into the intellectual foundation for a marketing campaign that reached every primary care physician in the United States and drove 500,000 people to their deaths was a specific family, with a specific amount of money, a specific product to sell, and a specific willingness to use every available scientific-sounding instrument, no matter how thin, how misrepresented, how fundamentally inapplicable to the question at hand, to move that product. The family's name was Sackler. The product was OxyContin, and the story of how one letter, one family, and one drug produced the deadliest pharmaceutical crisis in American history is, when you look at it in full, not primarily a story about addiction. It is a story about what happens when the apparatus of scientific credibility, the journals, the conferences, the academic appointments, the peer-reviewed publications, the clinical guidelines, the regulatory labels is systematically purchased, piece by piece, by people who understand exactly what that credibility is worth in the marketplace for human suffering. It is, in other words, a story about the specific mechanics of how science is manufactured. This is the last episode of a season about that subject. We have saved the most expensive lesson for last. The Sackler family's relationship with pharmaceutical marketing began long before OxyContin, and understanding that relationship is essential to understanding how the opioid crisis was built. Arthur Sackler was born in 1,913 inches, Brooklyn, the son of Jewish immigrants who had come from Eastern Europe. He trained as a psychiatrist, completing his medical degree in residency, practicing clinical medicine, but his genius was not for medicine. It was for marketing, specifically for the marketing of pharmaceuticals to physicians, the specific art of persuading doctors through advertising, through promotional material, through the cultivation of relationships between sales representatives and prescribers, through the design of messages that functioned simultaneously as scientific information and commercial advocacy. In the 1950s and 1960s, Arthur Sackler transformed the way the pharmaceutical industry marketed its products to physicians. Before his influence, pharmaceutical advertising was relatively restrained. Arthur changed that, working through his advertising agency, William Douglas McAdams Inc. He developed marketing campaigns for Valium, for Librium, for other psychoactive drugs, campaigns that reached physicians through medical journal advertising, through the cultivation of key opinion leaders, through the sponsorship of continuing medical education, through the construction of what would later be called thought leader, networks of prominent physicians who could be recruited to deliver favorable assessments of client products in their professional communications. He was, by every account, extraordinarily good at it. He understood that a physician's prescription behavior was shaped not primarily by clinical evidence, though evidence mattered, but by the opinions of respected colleagues, by the medical journal they read, by the sales representative who had taken them to dinner, by the seminar at the resort hotel, by the accumulated texture of a professional environment that had been carefully engineered to make prescribing a specific drug feel like the obvious clinical choice. He understood that authority could be manufactured, and that manufactured authority, when produced at sufficient scale and with sufficient investment, was functionally indistinguishable from the real thing. Arthur Sackler died in 1987. He died before OxyContin. He died before the opioid epidemic. His specific connection to the crisis that bears his family's name is retrospective. His techniques, his infrastructure, his philosophy of pharmaceutical marketing were inherited and applied by the generation that came after him. But understanding Arthur Sackler is essential to understanding what happened next. Because OxyContin was not launched as a drug. It was launched as an Arthur Sackler campaign. The scale was larger. The drug was more powerful. The consequences were more catastrophic. But the method, the key opinion leaders, the speaker programs, the journal advertising, the sales force saturation, the manufacture of scientific consensus through the strategic deployment of paid expertise was Arthur's method. His heirs had simply perfected it. In 1952, Arthur and his brothers, Mortimer and Raymond, had purchased a small Greenwich Village pharmaceutical company called Purdue Frederick. The company was modest. It made laxatives, earwax removers, basic pharmaceutical preparations, but it was a platform. Over the following decades, the Sackler brothers built Purdue into a significant pharmaceutical enterprise, focused initially on pain management. Their first major success in the opioid space was MS-Contin, an extended-release form of morphine, developed in the 1980s, designed for the management of severe cancer pain. MS-Contin worked. It provided genuine relief to patients with terminal cancer who needed sustained, consistent analgesia. It was a legitimate medical product, and it made the family very wealthy. By the early 1990s, MS-Contin was facing a problem that all pharmaceutical products eventually face. Its patent was running out. When a patent expires, generic manufacturers can produce the same compound at a fraction of the price, and the innovator's market share collapses almost overnight. MS-Contin's patent expiration was approaching, and Purdue needed a successor. It needed a new product. It needed the next thing. The next thing was Richard Sackler's idea. Richard Sackler was the son of Raymond Sackler, Arthur's brother. He had joined Purdue in 1971 and had worked his way through the organization's research and marketing functions for 2 decades. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, and he was a central figure in Purdue's direction. He was not, by any account, a detached corporate executive. He was engaged. He was specific. He pushed. What he pushed for was a new opioid painkiller, an extended-release formulation of oxycodone, a synthetic opioid that had been available in immediate-release form for decades, but had not previously been formulated for sustained 12-hour dosing. Oxycodone, in its immediate release form as Percocet and Percodan, was well known in clinical practice. It was a powerful opioid, used for moderate to severe acute pain, with a well-documented potential for abuse and addiction. It was a Schedule II controlled substance. Physicians prescribed it carefully, for limited periods, aware that it was addictive. Richard Sacklers' plan was to take oxycodone, deliver it in a controlled release formulation that would provide 12 hours of sustained pain relief, and market it not as the powerful, addiction-prone opioid that physicians understood it to be, but as a new kind of pain medication, one whose sustained release mechanism, the argument went, reduced its potential for abuse and addiction by delivering the drug gradually rather than in an immediate rush. The argument was, to put it plainly, not supported by evidence. Controlled release formulations of opioids do not reduce addiction risk. They may reduce the intensity of the initial euphoric effect compared to immediate release forms, which does make them somewhat less attractive to people seeking a high through oral consumption. But they do not reduce the physiological dependency that develops with sustained opioid use, and they are, by virtue of their extended duration of action and their higher per-tablet opioid load, substantially more dangerous than immediate release equivalents when crushed and snorted or dissolved for injection. The pill that Purdue was developing contained more oxycodone per tablet than any previously available formulation. The highest dose, 80 milligrams, delivered the equivalent of 16 standard Percocet tablets in a single pill. The controlled release mechanism that was supposed to make it safer was a coating that could be neutralized in 30 seconds with a pill crusher or a set of teeth. Purdue's research department, under Richard Sacklers' direction, prepared the OxyContin submission to the FDA. In 1995, the FDA approved OxyContin. The approval process included a specific and significant concession that would prove consequential. The OxyContin label was allowed to include language stating that the drug's delayed absorption was believed to reduce the abuse liability of the drug. Not that it had been proven to reduce abuse liability. Not that clinical trials had demonstrated lower rates of addiction. That it was believed to do so. Believed. By whom? On the basis of what evidence? The FDA's own reviewers had concerns. One FDA medical officer who reviewed the OxyContin application raised specific questions about the abuse liability claims and expressed reservations about the language of the proposed label. Those concerns were overridden. The label, with its believed to reduce the abuse liability language, was approved. The FDA's Curtis Wright, the medical officer who approved the OxyContin label, later left the FDA and took a job at Purdue Pharma. This is, in the regulatory context, a conflict of interest, of the kind that is usually politely described as a revolving door and more precisely described as the corruption of the regulatory process. In December 1995, OxyContin received FDA approval. In 1996, it was launched. The launch was not quiet. Purdue had prepared for it with the kind of investment and planning that is appropriate for a product you expect to transform a company's finances. They doubled their sales force to 600 representatives for the launch, each of whom would be visiting physicians across the country with materials, promotional items, samples, and a very specific message about what OxyContin was and what it could do. At the OxyContin launch party in 1996, Richard Sackler gave a speech. According to documents that would later become public through litigation, he said that they had worked long and hard to develop OxyContin, and that now, with its launch, a blizzard of prescriptions would rain down on them. He said, in the language of corporate excitement that characterized the moment, that the company should prepare for something large. He also said, According to internal meeting minutes from 1995, we do not want to niche OxyContin just for cancer pain. Not for cancer pain, not for the terminally ill. The primary population for whom sustained opioid therapy had been clinically established as appropriate, and who represented the existing market served by MS-Contin, not for the patients for whom continuous opioid therapy was clearly indicated and clearly justified. For everyone, for the far larger market of patients with chronic pain of any kind, back pain, arthritis, fibromyalgia, post-surgical pain. The vast category of pain conditions experienced by working-age adults whose physicians, until now, had been hesitant to put on long-term opioid therapy for precisely the reasons that the OxyContin marketing campaign was about to spend millions of dollars systematically dismantling. The market for chronic, non-cancer pain was, by any estimate, enormous. Before OxyContin, physicians had treated it primarily with non-opioid medications, anti-inflammatories, muscle relaxants, physical therapy, occasionally short courses of opioids for acute flares. Sustained opioid therapy for chronic non-cancer pain was not standard practice, not recommended by major clinical guidelines, and viewed by most physicians with the specific caution appropriate to a class of drugs whose addictive potential was both well-known and clinically documented. Purdue's task was to change how physicians thought about opioid therapy for chronic pain, to replace the caution with confidence, to transform the clinical culture around pain management in a way that made prescribing OxyContin not an exceptional decision requiring specific justification but a routine clinical choice. The obvious thing to reach for when a patient came in with a back that hurt. To do that, they needed science, or something that looked enough like science to pass. They had a family that understood exactly how to produce it. To understand how Purdue Pharma convinced American medicine that OxyContin was a safe, non-addictive treatment for chronic pain, you need to understand that the campaign was not built on one lie. It was built on a structure, an interlocking architecture of misrepresented research, paid expertise, manufactured consensus, and strategic ignorance that was designed to make the lie invisible by making it institutional. Let us start with what Purdue needed to overcome. The primary obstacle to widespread OxyContin prescribing for chronic pain was physician reluctance to prescribe strong opioids to non-cancer patients for long periods. This reluctance was not irrational. It was grounded in decades of clinical experience, with opioids experience that had established, with reasonable confidence, that long-term opioid therapy produced tolerance, physical dependence, and, in a significant proportion of patients, addiction. Every physician who had treated opioid use disorder, every physician who had watched a patient escalate from Percocet to heroin, every physician who had managed the withdrawal symptoms of a patient they had inadvertently made dependent, all of these physicians had specific, personal, clinical reasons to be cautious about putting their chronic pain patients on sustained opioid therapy. Purdue needed to neutralize that caution, and it did so through a coordinated campaign that operated on at least 5 simultaneous levels: the misrepresentation of existing science, the manufacture of new science, the purchasing of medical opinion leadership, the restructuring of pain medicine as a clinical specialty, and the strategic exploitation of the medical establishment's institutional reluctance to look too carefully at funding sources. The first level was the Porter and Jick letter. Purdue sales representatives were trained. This is documented to tell prescribers that the risk of addiction to OxyContin was less than 1%. The source for this claim was, in many iterations, Porter and Jick, a 1-paragraph letter about hospitalized patients on short-term narcotics, published in 1980. about drugs that were not OxyContin, in a patient population that had nothing to do with chronic outpatient pain management, was the scientific citation for the claim that chronic outpatient OxyContin use carried less than a 1% addiction risk. This was not a subtle misrepresentation. It was not a matter of imprecise language or overenthusiastic extrapolation. The letter specifically described inpatient use. It said nothing about chronic outpatient use. Purdue's representatives cited it as evidence for the safety of chronic outpatient use. The gap between what the letter said and what it was being used to claim was not a fine methodological distinction. It was the difference between apples and a sentence about oranges. Purdue knew this. Internal documents later produced in litigation showed that company employees had, at various points, raised questions about the accuracy of the less than 1% claim. The questions were not satisfactorily answered. The claim continued to be used. Citations of Porter and Jick in the medical literature increased dramatically after OxyContin's 1995 approval. The Canadian researchers who analyzed the citation pattern in 2017 specifically noted this spike. This is not coincidence. Purdue was funding conferences, sponsoring publications, paying physicians to speak and write. The documents that told prescribers addiction was rare needed to be in the medical literature. Purdue seeded the literature with them. The citations that validated the claims were, in significant part, the product of a funded operation designed to generate exactly those citations. The second level was the pain as the fifth vital sign movement. In 1996, the same year OxyContin was launched, the American Pain Society introduced a campaign to elevate pain assessment to the status of a fifth vital sign, to be measured and recorded alongside temperature, blood pressure, heart rate, and respiratory rate at every clinical encounter. The campaign had a genuine humanitarian motivation. Patient pain, particularly in hospitals and after surgery, was being systematically undertreated, and patients were suffering unnecessarily. The campaign was not, in its origin, a Purdue Pharma product, but Purdue saw it and embraced it. Because a medical culture that treated pain as the fifth vital sign that required physicians to assess and address pain at every encounter, that measured physician performance partly on how effectively they managed their patients' pain scores, was a medical culture that would, predictably, prescribe more opioids if pain was a vital sign. Undertreated pain was a clinical failure, and the best available medication for serious chronic pain was, in the narrative Purdue was constructing, OxyContin. The Veterans Health Administration adopted the pain as fifth vital sign framework as its national pain management strategy. The Joint Commission on Accreditation of Healthcare Organizations, which accredits hospitals and determines their eligibility for Medicare and Medicaid reimbursement, and began incorporating pain management into its accreditation standards. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, the institutional infrastructure of American medicine had been reorganized around the principle that pain must be aggressively treated, and the drug that Purdue was marketing was the one that aggressive treatment increasingly meant. The third level was the manufacture of clinical opinion. Purdue built what it called a speakers bureau, a network of physicians, eventually numbering in the thousands, who were paid to speak at conferences, at dinner seminars, at hospital grand rounds, at continuing medical education events, on behalf of OxyContin. These were real physicians with real clinical practices and real professional credentials. They were not frauds or shills in any crude sense. They were physicians who had been selected, cultivated, compensated, and supplied with Purdue-produced materials, slides, talking points, patient testimonials, clinical data in the specific form that supported the message Purdue wanted delivered, and who were, in the legitimate sense of the term, thought leaders, people whose opinions influenced the what made them effective was precisely that they were physicians. speaking to other physicians, in the settings, the medical conference, the hospital grand rounds, the continuing education seminar, where clinical opinion is legitimately formed. A sales representative telling a physician that OxyContin was safe and non-addictive was a sales pitch. The same message delivered by a pain specialist with an academic appointment at a conference in a hotel ballroom was medical education. Purdue also paid for the research that its paid speakers would eventually cite. The company funded studies on pain management and opioid therapy through grants to academic institutions and through direct research contracts. The studies were real studies, conducted by real researchers, published in real peer-reviewed journals. But the specific questions they were designed to ask, the specific populations they studied, the specific outcomes they measured, have been selected in many cases to produce results that could be incorporated into the pro-OxyContin narrative. A 2022 analysis found that between 2012 and 2017, Purdue paid more than $6 million to academic medical centers, teaching hospitals, and universities. The payments were largely disclosed. This was the post-2007 era, after Purdue's first guilty plea, when disclosure requirements were tighter. But disclosure is not the same as independence. A physician who has received research funding from Purdue, who has served on Purdue's Speakers Bureau, who has been flown to resort seminars at Purdue's expense, is not independent of Purdue in any meaningful sense. Regardless of what the disclosure form at the bottom of their journal article says, the fourth level was the concept of pseudo-addiction. In 1989, two pain medicine physicians, named David Haddix and David Weissman, published a case report describing what they called pseudo-addiction, a clinical phenomenon in which patients with undertreated pain exhibited behavior that appeared to be addiction, drug-seeking behavior, escalating requests for more medication, requests for early refills, but was actually the result of inadequate pain management rather than genuine dependency. Treat the pain adequately, the argument went, and the behavior resolves. The concept was not entirely fabricated. Undertreated pain is real, and patients with undertreated pain do sometimes behave in ways that can superficially resemble addiction. But as a clinical concept applied at scale to the prescribing of OxyContin, pseudo-addiction became something more dangerous, a framework that allowed physicians to reinterpret signs of genuine opioid use disorder as evidence that they needed to prescribe more, not less. A patient calling for early refills was, in the pseudo-addiction framework, undertreated. The appropriate response was to increase the dose. David Haddix, one of the coiners of the pseudo-addiction concept, later became a paid employee of Purdue Pharma. He served as Purdue's vice president for health policy. He testified before state legislatures and regulatory bodies on opioid policy in his capacity as both a physician and a Purdue executive. His testimony, consistently, argued for fewer restrictions on opioid prescribing, the pharmaceutical marketing term for someone who moves between clinical credibility and corporate employment in this way is key opinion leader. The medical ethics term is a conflict of interest, so complete that it is difficult to identify where the physician ends and the company begins. Russell Portnoy, a prominent New York pain specialist and one of the most influential voices in American pain medicine for 2 decades, played a similarly important role. Portnoy was not a Purdue employee. He was an academic physician at Memorial Sloan Kettering, then at Beth Israel Medical Center. But he received significant funding from Purdue and from other opioid manufacturers. He was a prominent advocate for more liberal opioid prescribing for chronic non-cancer pain. He gave lectures, wrote papers, advised medical journals, trained the next generation of pain specialists, and consistently delivered the message that opioids were underused, that concerns about addiction were overstated, and that physicians who hesitated to prescribe them were failing their patients. In 2012, by which point the opioid epidemic was an established and documented public health catastrophe, with overdose deaths rising year after year, Portnoy gave an interview to the Wall Street Journal, in which he said, with notable candor, that he had spread the gospel of opioid therapy and had overstated the evidence. He had said opioids are safe and effective, a statement he now recognized was misinformation. He said he had made the argument many times before audiences of physicians, legislators, and the public that opioids for chronic pain posed minimal addiction risk. Did I teach people to be more aggressive about opioid prescribing? Absolutely. He said, did I teach them to be too aggressive? Absolutely. He said it with what appeared to be genuine remorse. He said it in 2012, when the death toll from the epidemic he had helped enable was rising past 16,000 Americans per year. The fifth level, and in some ways the most important, was the 12-hour claim, and what Purdue knew about it. OxyContin was marketed as a medication that provided 12 hours of pain relief per dose. This was its central selling proposition. Q12H. Twice-daily dosing was the core message of the marketing campaign. The sales representatives gave out clocks labeled Q12H. The promotional materials repeated it. The clinical studies Purdue submitted for FDA approval were designed around it. The problem was that OxyContin did not, for many patients, provide 12 hours of pain relief. Purdue knew this. Internal documents later released through litigation showed that the company's own clinical data, as early as the late 1990s, indicated that a substantial proportion of patients experienced significant pain relief for only 8 hours, sometimes less, before the drug wore off and their pain returned, a phenomenon called end-of-dose failure. The return of pain before the next scheduled dose was not just a clinical inconvenience. For a patient physically dependent on an opioid, which OxyContin users became rapidly, through the normal pharmacology of continuous opioid exposure, the return of pain before the next dose was accompanied by the early symptoms of withdrawal, anxiety, restlessness, sweating, intensified pain, the specific sensation that is, in the phenomenology of addiction, experienced as craving. The solution, from the patient's perspective, was to take the next dose early, or to take more, or to crush the tablet to bypass the controlled release mechanism and get the full dose at once. Purdue's response to the evidence of end-of-dose failure was not to recommend more frequent dosing, which would have acknowledged that the 12-hour claim was not universally accurate. More frequent dosing would have undermined the competitive advantage of OxyContin against immediate-release opioids. Instead, Purdue's standard response to physicians who reported that their patients were experiencing end-of-dose failure was to recommend increasing the dose. Give more OxyContin at 12 hours. Higher doses. The company's internal training materials instructed sales representatives on how to respond to physicians who raised the end-of-dose failure concern with exactly this message. Increase the dose. Higher doses. Higher doses that made the drug more dangerous. Higher doses that made patients more dependent. Higher doses that, when the tablet was crushed, produced the euphoric rush that makes opioids addictive. Higher doses that, in overdose, were more likely to cause fatal respiratory depression. The Los Angeles Times, in a 2016 investigation based on internal Purdue documents, interviewed more than 100 patients who said OxyContin had worn off early. It reviewed hundreds of medical records. A Purdue sales manager, in a 2001 internal document, acknowledged the duration problem. Purdue executives discussed it internally. One internal analysis found that in 2014, More than 52% of patients taking OxyContin for longer than 3 months were prescribed doses greater than 60 milligrams per day, a level that the CDC's guidelines described as a threshold above which opioid-related risks increased dramatically. Higher doses in the majority of long-term users. Because the 12-hour pill didn't last 12 hours. Purdue knew. The sales force knew. Physicians who raised the concern were given a script that directed them, with the authority of Purdue's clinical expertise, to write a higher prescription. The higher prescription increased the revenue. The higher prescription increased the dependency. The higher prescription. When the patient eventually lost that prescription or couldn't afford it or was cut off by a physician who finally grew concerned, was the specific dose level that made the transition to heroin feel like the only available relief. This is the specific architecture of how the scientific deception operated. Not in a single document. Not in a single meeting. In the cumulative, interlocking structure of a campaign that had taken every available instrument of scientific credibility, the peer-reviewed journal citation, the key opinion leader, the continuing medical education program, the regulatory label, the clinical guideline, and run them systematically in the direction of a single commercial objective: more prescriptions, higher doses, longer duration, more revenue for the family. Before we talk about what happened to the towns, we need to understand how the pills got there. The pharmaceutical industry has, for decades, maintained a sales force called detailers, or detail men, whose job is to visit physicians in their offices and make the case for the company's products. This is a normal part of pharmaceutical commerce. The detail representative brings samples, brings clinical materials, builds a relationship with the physician over repeated visits. In most pharmaceutical contexts, the detail force is a supplementary channel, reinforcing messages that physicians are receiving from other sources, from journal advertising, from conferences, from their own clinical training. Purdue's detail force for OxyContin was not supplementary. It was the primary mechanism of distribution, and it was built and operated with a specific intensity that distinguished it from the ordinary pharmaceutical sales force. At launch in 1996, Purdue doubled its sales force to 600 representatives. Bij 2001, there were more than one. Ling. Each representative was responsible for a territory of physicians and was compensated through a base salary plus a bonus structure tied directly to OxyContin prescription volume in their territory. The more OxyContin their physicians prescribed, the more the representative earned. In some years, top-performing representatives earned bonuses that tripled their base salary. The incentive structure was transparent. Write more prescriptions. Get more money. The representatives called on primary care physicians, family practitioners, internists, the physicians most likely to have patients presenting with chronic pain conditions. They came bearing not just promotional materials but gifts, branded merchandise, clocks marked Q, 12, H, free meals at restaurant dinners where a paid speaker would deliver a continuing medical education presentation on pain management, invitations to all expenses paid symposia at resort hotels. The resort junkets were technically educational events. Physicians earned continuing medical education credits for attending. The education they received was curated by Purdue, delivered by Purdue's paid speakers, and designed to arrive at the conclusion that OxyContin was the appropriate treatment for chronic pain in a wide range of patients who had previously not been considered appropriate candidates for long-term opioid therapy. This was not unusual in the pharmaceutical industry of the late 1990s and early 2000s. Other companies did similar things. What made Purdue's operation distinctive was its scale, its targeting precision, and its specific willingness to continue operating in the face of evidence that should have, by any responsible standard, prompted restraint. Purdue used prescription data, which it purchased from data brokers who collected and sold information about physician prescribing patterns, to identify the highest volume opioid prescribers in each territory. Concentrate the detail forces attention on them. Physicians who prescribe the most opioids receive the most visits, the most dinners, the most invitations to resort seminars. This is a standard marketing practice. Focus resources on the most productive targets. In the context of opioid prescribing, this practice had a specific consequence. The physicians who received the most attention from Purdue's sales force were the physicians most likely to be already prescribing opioids aggressively, which was correlated with physicians who were operating at the margins of appropriate clinical practice, or beyond them. Purdue's marketing machine was, by its design, most intensively focused on the prescribers, most likely to be pill mills. Internal documents later released through litigation showed that Purdue employees knew this. In one 2009 case, documented in the Massachusetts AG's complaint, a Purdue sales manager wrote to a company official that Purdue was promoting opioids to what he described as an illegal pill mill. "I feel very certain this is an organized drug ring," he wrote. He asked, "Shouldn't the DE be contacted about this?" Purdue did nothing for 2 years. Not a week. Not a month. 2 years. The manager raised the concern in 2009. Purdue failed to report the suspicious prescribing to the DEA until 2011. In those 2 years, the organization the sales manager had identified as an organized drug ring continued to receive OxyContin promotional attention and continued to generate OxyContin prescriptions. This was not an isolated incident. It was, according to the complaint, the institutional pattern. When evidence of inappropriate prescribing surfaced through the sales force, the company's default response was not to curtail marketing to the problematic prescriber. It was to evaluate the situation on a case-by-case basis while the revenue continued to flow. Now let us talk about what this looked like in the specific places where it landed. Mingo County, West Virginia, population approximately 25. Ling Ling Ling, a county whose economy had been built on coal mining and whose coal mining had, by the 1990s, been substantially automated and contracted, leaving a workforce with high rates of occupational injury, chronic musculoskeletal pain, limited healthcare access, and no particular reason to expect that the pharmaceutical industry was about to make things worse. Between 2006 and 2016, according to DEA data, later obtained by the Washington Post, 20 million oxycodone and hydrocodone pills were shipped to Mingo County, a county of 25,000 people. That is approximately 800 pills per person, per year. For a decade. The town of Kermit, West Virginia, population approximately 400. A single pharmacy in Kermit received, in a 2-year period, approximately 9 million hydrocodone pills. 9 million pills. For a town of 400 people. McKesson Corporation, one of the 3 pharmaceutical distributors that together controlled approximately 90% of drug distribution in the United States, shipped those pills. No one flagged the order as suspicious. No one reported it to the DEA. The pharmacy filled the prescriptions. The pills moved through Kermit and into the broader network of distribution and use that covered the surrounding region. West Virginia as a whole received, between 2006 and 2012, 780 million opioid pills, enough, as journalists covering the crisis observed, to give every man, woman, and child in the state 433 pills per year for 6 years. The state had one of the highest rates of opioid overdose mortality in the country. It had the specific industrial history: coal, chemical plants, logging that produced high rates of occupational injury and chronic pain. It had limited healthcare infrastructure in its rural counties. It had poverty. It had everything that the specific geography of the opioid epidemic required. And it had pharmaceutical distributors who saw the prescription volume and shipped the pills anyway. McDowell County, West Virginia, once the heart of the American coal industry. The county whose miners had produced the fuel that powered the country's industrial economy. Population in the 1950s, approximately 100. Ling. Population in 2000, approximately 27. Ling. Population today, approximately 17. Ling. The coal companies closed the mines. The jobs left. The young people left. The people who remained the middle-aged and older miners. The families whose lives and identities had been built around an industry that no longer needed them stayed in a county with no economic base, high rates of disability and chronic pain from decades of underground work, and a pharmaceutical sales force that arrived in the late 1990s with a message about a new kind of pain medication. McDowell County has, since 1999, consistently recorded among the highest opioid overdose death rates in the United States. At its peak, the county's overdose death rate was more than 6 times the national average. It is a county where the intersecting forces of economic collapse, chronic disease, inadequate health care, and pharmaceutical predation produced a specific, documented, measurable catastrophe. The human texture of what happened in these places is not fully captured by the statistics. Though the statistics are devastating, it is captured more completely in the specific stories of specific people, which are everywhere in the record of this epidemic, and which share the quality of all tragic stories. They are ordinary until they are not. Corey Merrill was 15 years old when he was prescribed OxyContin following hernia surgery. 15. His mother, Cheryl Ware of Marlborough, Massachusetts, described how her youngest son slid from a post-surgical opioid prescription into a long struggle with addiction that lasted 8 years and ended with his death by overdose at 23. He left behind an infant daughter, his brother Sean, who had first tried opioids with Corey, struggled with survivor's guilt and substance use disorder for years. He died too. Cheryl Ware lost 2 of her 3 sons to opioids. Both of them had started with prescription pills. She testified at a bankruptcy hearing in 2022 in the specific forum of a federal courtroom conducting the financial reorganization of a pharmaceutical company before members of the family whose company had produced the pills that had killed her sons. She told them about the guttural noise that had escaped her body when she learned of each son's death. She was given a time limit for her testimony. She had to cut her prepared statement in half. The Merrill brothers are not exceptional. They are representative. They are 2 of more than 500,000 Americans who have died of opioid overdoses since 1999, a death toll that encompasses 3 distinct waves. The first wave of prescription opioid deaths, which began in the late 1990s with OxyContin and the associated broadening of opioid prescribing. The second wave of heroin deaths, which began around 2010 as prescription opioids became harder to obtain and cheaper heroin filled the demand that prescription addiction had created. And the third wave of synthetic opioid deaths, primarily fentanyl, which began around 2013 and which, as of 2023, accounts for the majority of American overdose deaths. The connection between these 3 waves is direct and documented. OxyContin created the population of opioid-dependent Americans. When OxyContin became harder to obtain through prescription monitoring programs, through physician reluctance following the first wave of adverse publicity, through the 2010 reformulation that made the pills harder to crush and snort, people dependent on opioids did not stop being dependent. They found what was available. In the early 2010s, what was available was heroin, which was cheaper than prescription pills, produced in Mexico, and flooding into the communities where OxyContin had created the demand. After 2013, what was available was fentanyl 50 to 100 times more potent than morphine, manufactured cheaply in illicit labs, mixed into heroin supplies, and increasingly pressed into pills designed to look like prescription opioids. The overdose deaths from illicitly manufactured fentanyl, the third wave, have nothing to do, in their proximate cause, with Purdue Pharma or OxyContin. The fentanyl is manufactured in different places by different people for different reasons. But the population that is dying from fentanyl overdoses is, in very significant part, the population that was first exposed to opioids through the prescription cascade that Purdue's marketing created. The addiction that OxyContin established is the vulnerability that fentanyl exploits. Purdue did not manufacture fentanyl. Purdue manufactured the people who needed it. During the first wave, as evidence of OxyContin addiction accumulated in the medical literature and in the press, Purdue's internal response was documented in emails that would later become among the most quoted documents in the history of corporate culpability. In 2009, as news coverage of OxyContin addiction was becoming impossible to ignore, Richard Sackler wrote to the company's sales force. He had attended a party the previous evening at which a prominent politician had discussed the growing opioid problem. He wrote an email. The email said, "We have to hammer on the abusers in every way possible. They are the culprits and the problem. They are reckless criminals. The abusers, the culprits, the reckless criminals." The people Richard Sackler was describing as reckless criminals were the people who had become physically dependent on OxyContin, in many cases after being prescribed it by physicians who had been told by Purdue's sales force, with the authority of Porter and Jick and the entire manufactured apparatus of pain medicine consensus, that addiction risk was less than 1%. They were people who had been prescribed a drug whose 12-hour dosing claim was false, who had been told by the company's paid physicians that their escalating need for the drug was pseudo-addiction, undertreated pain, rather than genuine dependency, who had been encouraged by dose escalation recommendations to take more and more of a substance that their bodies had become incapable of functioning without. Richard Sackler called them reckless criminals. The email was written in 2001. OxyContin had been on the market for 5 years. There were already thousands of documented cases of OxyContin-related addiction and overdose. The DA was investigating. Journalists were reporting. State attorneys general were beginning to raise concerns. The shape of what was happening was visible to anyone who was looking. Richard Sackler was looking. He saw criminals. Meanwhile, the McKinsey consulting firm was also looking. McKinsey had been retained by Purdue as a strategic consultant. In 2017, 20 years into the epidemic, as overdose deaths were approaching 50,000 per year, McKinsey consultants presented a strategy to members of the Sackler family for boosting OxyContin sales. The strategy included a suggestion that Purdue pay pharmaceutical distributors a rebate for every overdose that could be attributed to the pills the distributor had sold. A financial rebate for overdoses. The proposal was framed in the bureaucratic language of incentive alignment. Distributors would receive a payment when an overdose occurred, which would, theoretically, incentivize them to report suspicious orders. The proposal was presented. It was discussed. It was not ultimately implemented in the form described, but it was the specific document that a McKinsey consultant produced and presented to the Sackler family as a serious strategic option in 2017. As 450,000 Americans had already died, and more were dying every day. McKinsey did not write this document in the middle of the night. In secret, fearing discovery, they wrote it as a business presentation. They printed it. They put it in slides. They presented it to their client. In 2021, McKinsey paid $537 million to settle claims from 47 states, the District of Columbia, and 5 territories arising from its consulting work for Purdue and other opioid manufacturers. It agreed not to work with companies on certain narcotics, McKinsey's global managing partner said, in a statement, that the firm hoped to be part of the solution to the opioid crisis. The firm that had suggested paying rebates for overdoses hoped to be part of the solution. In May 3 senior executives of Purdue Pharma walked into a federal courthouse in Roanoke, Virginia, and pleaded guilty. Michael Friedman, the company's president, Howard Udell, its top lawyer, Paul Goldenheim, its chief medical officer, 3 of the most senior people in the organization that had spent the previous decade misleading physicians, training sales representatives to misrepresent addiction risk, and saturating rural America with a drug whose 12-hour efficacy claim was false. They pleaded guilty to misbranding OxyContin specifically, to making misleading claims about the drug's addiction potential. The company, through its affiliate, Purdue Frederick, pleaded guilty to a felony charge of fraudulently misrepresenting OxyContin to doctors and patients. It agreed to pay $634, $5 million in fines, one of the largest pharmaceutical fines in American history at that time. The 3 executives, as part of their plea, agreed to pay $34, $5 million in personal fines. They did not go to prison. Not one day. Not 1 hour. They paid money. The company paid money. They walked out of the federal courthouse in Roanoke to their corporate jet and flew back to Connecticut. John Brownlee, the federal prosecutor who had worked the case for years, said, the guilty pleas sent an important message to the pharmaceutical industry. The message the industry received was somewhat different from the one he intended. No member of the Sackler family was charged in 2007. No member of the Sackler family was named in the indictment. The corporate structure of Purdue, which had kept the family's names off the company's public face for years, known by Forbes as the OxyContin clan, but careful to maintain a separation between the family's public philanthropic identity and the specific drug whose profits had financed it, provided the insulation. The company pleaded guilty. The executives pleaded guilty. The family paid nothing. The family was not mentioned. What happened after the 2007 guilty plea is, in the specific moral calculus of the opioid epidemic, its most important chapter, because the thing that happened after the 2007 guilty plea was that Purdue continued. The company that had just been convicted of federal felony misbranding continued to market OxyContin. It continued to promote the drug to physicians. It continued to operate its sales force. It paid the fine. Issued a statement about regret for past misstatements made by some employees. And continued, for another 12 years, to sell OxyContin. Between 2007 and 2017, the decade after the guilty plea, the decade in which the opioid epidemic's death toll climbed from approximately 15,000 Americans per year to more than 47,000. The Sackler family extracted more than $10 billion from Purdue Pharma. $10 billion. In dividends. In transfers. In payments. routed through a network of trusts and shell entities in ways that, according to multiple state attorneys general, constituted fraudulent conveyance, the systematic transfer of assets away from a company its owners knew was facing potentially unlimited liability, into structures designed to be beyond the reach of future creditors. They knew what was coming. They had paid $635 million in 2007 and watched the company continue. They knew more lawsuits would follow. They took the money out while it was still there to take. Forbes magazine named them, at the peak of their wealth, one of the 15 richest families in the United States, richer than the Mellons, richer than the Rockefellers. The specific comparison to the Rockefellers is not incidental. The Rockefeller fortune was built on Standard Oil, the monopoly that extracted wealth from American industrial infrastructure at the expense of competition, labor, and communities. The Sackler fortune at its peak was built on OxyContin, the monopoly that extracted wealth from American pain at the expense of the people in it. The analogy is imperfect in its specifics and precise in its structure. The Sackler name was everywhere. The Sackler wing at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the famous Temple of Dendur, housed in a glass-enclosed space that bears the family name on its wall. One of the most prestigious cultural real estate positions in New York City. Purchased through a donation in 1974 that predated OxyContin but was maintained and expanded through donations made possible by the profits that OxyContin generated. The Arthur M. Sackler Gallery at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington. The Sackler Museum at Harvard. The Sackler Center for Arts Education at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. The Sackler Gallery at the Serpentine in London. The Sackler Galleries at the Royal Academy in London. Institutions in Paris, in New York, in Washington, in London, in Jerusalem. The specific geography of cultural respectability, purchased with the proceeds of a drug that was killing people in Kermit, West Virginia, and McDowell County and Mingo County, and the rural communities of eastern Kentucky and the suburbs of Ohio and the working-class neighborhoods of New Hampshire and Maine. The philanthropic strategy was not accidental. Patrick Radden Keefe, whose empire of pain is the definitive account of the Sackler family and Purdue Pharma, documented extensively the degree to which the family's philanthropy was understood internally as a mechanism for building the kind of cultural and institutional prestige that would insulate the family's name from the consequences of its business activities. The name on the museum wall was the same name on the corporate filing, but the museum wall was what you could see. You did not have to go to Kermit, West Virginia, to see the museum wall. Nan Goldin changed that. Goldin is a photographer, one of the most significant American artists of the late 20th century. Known primarily for her intimate, unflinching documentation of communities at the margins, the downtown New York art world of the 1970s and 1980s, the AIDS crisis, and the specific subcultures of queer and subcultural life that her work rendered visible and human. She became addicted to OxyContin after it was prescribed to her for a wrist injury. She nearly died of an overdose in 2017. After her recovery, she founded an organization called Prescription Addiction Intervention Now, and launched a campaign to pressure cultural institutions to remove the Sackler name from their buildings. Tactics were direct. At the Guggenheim Museum, activists dropped thousands of fake OxyContin prescription slips from the rotunda balcony onto the visitors below, a visual that was both spectacular and precise, the pills raining down from above. In the museum funded by the same family, at the Metropolitan Museum, stage die-ins in the Temple of Dendur. Activist lying on the floor of the Sackler wing in front of the ancient Egyptian temple while holding signs listing the Sackler family's role in the epidemic. The actions worked. The Metropolitan Museum announced in 2021 that it would remove the Sackler name from its wing. The Tate in London, the Louvre in Paris, the Guggenheim, the Victoria and Albert. The Smithsonian institution after institution announced that it would no longer accept donations from members of the Sackler family or would remove the Sackler name from its spaces. Some of these decisions were made under pressure. Some were made as a form of preemptive reputation management. Some were made by institution leaders who had genuinely concluded that the specific source of the philanthropy was incompatible with the values the institution was supposed to represent. The name came down. The dead stayed dead. In September 2019, Purdue Pharma filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection in White Plains, New York. By that point, more than 600 federal and state lawsuits had been filed against the company and its owners. 48 states, more than 500 cities, counties, and tribal governments had sued Purdue. The litigation was existential. The company could not survive it. Bankruptcy was the legal mechanism by which the Sackler family proposed to resolve the claims, a single, negotiated settlement that would pay out from Purdue's assets and from the family's own contributions, in exchange for the broad legal immunity that bankruptcy proceedings can, under certain interpretations of the law, provide. The settlement that emerged from the bankruptcy proceedings was, initially, a deal under which Purdue would be dissolved, and its assets used to fund opioid abatement programs, and the Sackler family would contribute approximately $4.5 billion to the settlement, in exchange for a blanket release from all future opioid-related civil claims. The total settlement value was characterized as approximately $8.3 billion. Though the specific payment mechanisms and timelines made the actual cash value considerably more ambiguous than that headline figure suggested. In October 2020, Purdue pleaded guilty to 3 additional federal felonies: conspiracy to defraud the United States, conspiracy to violate the federal anti-kickback statute, and conspiracy to violate the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. The plea agreement required Purdue to pay more than $8.3 billion in criminal and civil penalties. The company was to be dissolved. Its assets would be used to fund opioid abatement programs and satisfy the claims of the hundreds of thousands of victims who had filed. The Sackler family, in the initial settlement framework, was to pay $4.5 billion and receive, in exchange, permanent immunity from future civil lawsuits. Not criminal immunity. The family had not been charged with crimes, but civil immunity. The specific legal maneuver through which a private family, using a corporation's bankruptcy to obtain a blanket civil release they could not have obtained in ordinary litigation. It was the thing that eventually produced the most legally significant development in the entire Purdue saga. In 2021, a federal bankruptcy judge approved the settlement. States that had objected appealed. In 2023, a federal appeals court overturned the approval, finding that the bankruptcy code did not permit a third-party release, did not allow a bankruptcy court to grant civil immunity to people who had not themselves filed for bankruptcy on these terms. Purdue and the Sacklers appealed to the Supreme Court. In June 2024, the Supreme Court ruled 5-4 that the bankruptcy court had exceeded its authority in granting the Sacklers civil immunity. The settlement was invalidated. The family was, once again, exposed to the civil litigation from which they had attempted to purchase protection through the bankruptcy process. The family went back to negotiating in late 2024 and 2025. A new settlement was reached. A bipartisan coalition of states announced a $7 $4 billion agreement with members of the Sackler family described as the largest settlement with individuals responsible for contributing to the opioid crisis in American history. The settlement ends the Sacklers' control of Purdue and bars them from selling opioids in the United States. It will deliver funding to participating states, local governments, and affected individuals over 15 years to support opioid treatment and prevention programs. $7.4 billion. That number is large. Let us be precise about what it means. The Sackler family, according to the most comprehensive estimates, extracted more than $10 billion from Purdue Pharma, primarily between 2008 and 2018. During the decade when the epidemic was at its worst and the company was facing the lawsuits it knew were coming, they extracted this money specifically, according to state attorneys general, in multiple jurisdictions, to make it unavailable to future creditors, to move it beyond the reach of the victims who would eventually be suing. The $10 billion went into trusts, into offshore accounts, into entities whose structure was specifically designed to survive a Purdue bankruptcy intact. The $7.4 billion settlement requires them to pay back over 15 years, somewhat less than the amount they extracted during the epidemic's peak. The family remains wealthy, vastly wealthy. The settlements, all of them combined, from the 2007 plea through the $7.4 billion agreement, have not made the Sacklers poor. They have made them less rich than they were. They remain among the wealthiest families in America, and no member of the Sackler family has been criminally charged. Arthur Sackler died in 1987, before OxyContin, and his branch of the family had divested from Purdue before the drug was developed. Mortimer Sackler døde in 2010. Raymond Sackler died in 2017. Richard Sackler, the president of Purdue during the epidemic's first and most decisive decade. The man who said the abusers were reckless criminals. The man who oversaw the marketing machine that taught a generation of physicians that long-term opioid therapy was safe. Who directed the dose escalation strategy when the 12-hour claim failed. Who built the business, whose revenue he and his family extracted as the people it was built on died. Richard Sackler is alive. He has paid civil settlements. He has not been charged with a crime. This is what the settlement changed. The amount of money the family has. It did not change the fact that they have it. It did not change the fact that the deaths continue. Fentanyl overdose deaths in the United States exceeded 73. 0.2022 alone. In communities whose relationship with opioids was established by the drug that the Sacklers marketed and the science they bought. It did not change the fact that no individual has been held criminally responsible for the deliberate, documented, evidence decision to tell American physicians that addiction to OxyContin was rare when the company knew, had known, and continued to know that it was not. The title of this episode is The Pill That Wasn't Addictive. It was addictive. It was always addictive. Oxycodone is an opioid. It binds to the same receptors as heroin. It produces the same physiological dependency. It causes the same withdrawal. The controlled release formulation did not change the pharmacology of the molecule. The Porter and Jick letter did not change the pharmacology of the molecule. The paid speakers, and the resort junkets, and the Q12H clocks, and the false label, and the pseudo-addiction framework, and the pain as fifth vital sign campaign, and the specific targeting of the highest volume prescribers, none. The teens of these things changed. The pharmacology of the molecule. They changed what physicians believed about the pharmacology of the molecule. For a fee, 500,000 dead Americans. The Sackler family estimates at the time of the crisis peak, $14 billion. The 2007 criminal fine, $634 million, which is approximately 5% of what the company made from OxyContin in its first 6 years alone. The 2020 criminal settlement, $8, $3 billion, of which most was to be paid from the proceeds of the company that was being dissolved, not from the family's private wealth. The $7, $4 billion Sackler family settlement, to be paid over 15 years, from a family that retained substantial private wealth after the payment. The settlement changed nothing about who is alive and who is dead. It changed nothing about the 30 states that, as of 2023, I still have insufficient treatment capacity for opioid use disorder. It changed nothing about the communities in Mingo County and McDowell County in eastern Kentucky that were, by any measure of community health and economic vitality, destroyed by the epidemic that the OxyContin marketing campaign set in motion. It paid money. It did not provide accountability. It did not provide an answer to the specific question that the Tuskegee study raised 40 years ago about the relationship between research institutions and the populations they study, and that the tobacco industry raised 50 years ago about the relationship between science and commerce, and that Andrew Wakefield raised 25 years ago about the relationship between peer review and fraud. What does a society do when the institutions built to protect it are the institutions doing the harm? What the settlements say is, it pays them, and then the institutions continue. This is the last episode of a season about peer-reviewed science being used to manufacture harm. In 5 episodes, we have told the stories of 5 cases. The cigarette that never caused cancer, the family tree they wanted to prune, the experiment that wasn't supposed to end, the paper that broke the world, the pill that wasn't addictive. 5 cases, 5 institutions, the tobacco industry's scientific apparatus, the eugenics movement's academic infrastructure, the United States Public Health Service, the Royal Free Hospital School of Medicine, the Sackler family's pharmaceutical empire, each of which used the specific authority of credentialed, published, peer-reviewed science to manufacture a claim that was false, and each of which sustained that claim in the face of accumulating evidence of harm, until the harm became too large to contain. In every case, the people who died were not the people who designed the study, published the paper, or ran the company. In every case, the people who were watched, or deceived, or exposed to the manufactured lie, were the people with the least power to protect themselves from it. The sharecroppers in Macon County, the feeble-minded women in Virginia asylums, the smokers who believed the scientists who said cigarettes were safe, the children who didn't get the MMR vaccine because their parents believed the Lancet, the patients in chronic pain who believed their doctors, who believed the sales representatives, who believed the Porter and Jick letter. In every case, the institutions that should have caught the fraud, the peer reviewers, the regulatory bodies, the professional associations, the funding agencies, the university ethics committees either failed to catch it or, in some cases, actively participated in sustaining it. And in every case, the reckoning when it came not from within the institutions but from outside them. From a whistleblower who gave documents to a reporter, from a journalist who spent years comparing medical records to published papers, from a photographer who nearly died and decided to throw prescription slips off a museum balcony, from the people who were harmed, or who watched their children be harmed, who refused to accept that the institution's version of events was the only version that mattered. Science is not the problem. Science is the method by which human beings reduce their ignorance of the world. And it remains, despite everything in this season, the best method we have. The problem is what happens when the authority of science is separated from its accountability, when the credential and the journal name and the peer review imprimatur become tools that can be purchased and deployed in the service of any conclusion that a sufficiently well-funded institution needs to be true. The authority of science is not self-enforcing. It depends on the integrity of the people and institutions that produce and review and publish and cite and regulate and fund it. When those people and institutions fail through negligence, through corruption, through the specific moral compartmentalization that allows a researcher to watch a man die of a curable disease and call it data, or a pharmaceutical executive to read the overdose statistics and call the dead reckless criminals, the authority of science becomes a weapon in the hands of whoever is holding the pen. 500,000 Americans died because the sentence, "The development of addiction is rare," was in the New England Journal of Medicine. Not because the sentence was false. Exactly, it was the summary of one study, in one hospital, for one class of drug, over one period. It was the wrong sentence, for the wrong context, applied at the wrong scale. But it was in the New England Journal of Medicine. And that was enough. That is what peer review is worth. When the institutions that deploy it are not accountable to the people who die,